The mornings were all the same. Margo would wake before the sun, wrap herself in her robe, and sit by the kitchen window with her cup of tea. The world outside felt distant, almost like a painting she could observe but never truly touch. At 53, Margo's life had settled into a routine so unchanging it felt almost invisible. After her divorce a decade ago and her children moving on to build their own lives, the days seemed to stretch endlessly, filled with chores, books she had half-heartedly picked up, and the occasional call from a friend. Loneliness had become a quiet companion, one she rarely acknowledged out loud, but carried with her everywhere. It was a Friday when everything shifted. Margo had stopped at the local grocery store after her morning walk, just like she always did. She was reaching for a bag of oranges when a voice startled her. "Let me get that for you." She turned and saw him. A man in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, with warm hazel eyes and a disarming smile. His dark hair was slightly messy, as if he'd just stepped out of the wind. "Oh, thank you," she managed, stepping aside as he effortlessly plucked the bag from the top shelf and handed it to her. "No problem," he said, his tone friendly but casual. He glanced at her cart and added, "Good choice. These oranges are always the sweetest." She chuckled softly, a little taken aback by the ease of his comment. "Well, I'll take your word for it." He nodded, gave her another quick smile, and walked away, leaving her standing there with the bag of oranges still in her hands. It was a simple interaction, nothing extraordinary. Yet, as Margo wandered the aisles, she found herself replaying it in her mind. Something about him had disrupted her routine, not in a grand, dramatic way, but in the way a single ray of sunlight could change the feel of a room. She caught a glimpse of him again at the checkout line, chatting with the cashier. His laugh carried over the hum of the store, light and genuine. As Margo drove home, the bag of oranges nestled in her passenger seat, she felt an unfamiliar flicker of something she couldn't quite name. Curiosity, maybe. Or was it hope? For the first time in years, the quiet of her house didn't feel so heavy when she stepped inside. She placed the oranges on the counter, her mind still lingering on that brief exchange. It was nothing, she told herself. Just a moment. And yet, deep down, Margo couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted the following week. Margo returned to the grocery store. She told herself it was simply out of habit, a part of her regular routine. But as she walked through the familiar aisles, her eyes subconsciously scanned for him. She spotted him near the coffee section, comparing two brands with a thoughtful expression. For a moment, she hesitated, unsure whether to approach him. Then, as if sensing her presence, he looked up and smiled. "Back for more oranges?" he teased lightly. Margo felt her cheeks warm. "Not today. Though they were as sweet as you promised." He laughed, a rich, unguarded sound that seemed to fill the space around them. "I'm Alex, by the way." "Margo," she replied, extending her hand. What began as a brief conversation about coffee brands stretched into 15 minutes of easy chatter. Alex had a natural way of making people feel at ease. He told her about his love of cooking, how he was always experimenting with new recipes. Margo shared a few of her own cooking misadventures, surprising herself with how easily the words came. After that day, their paths seemed to cross more frequently. Sometimes it was at the grocery store, other times at the local park where Margo often walked. Each time, they'd exchange smiles, then words, and soon their conversations became something Margo began to look forward to. It wasn't long before Alex suggested they grab coffee together. They sat in a small cafe by the river, sunlight streaming through the windows. Margo found herself laughing more than she had in years, her usual guardedness melting away. Alex spoke with a kind of enthusiasm that was infectious, sharing stories of his travels and his dreams of opening a restaurant one day. "You're easy to talk to," he said at one point, his eyes meeting hers. Margo blinked, caught off guard. "I could say the same about you." He smiled, but there was something more in his expression, an openness, a warmth that lingered even as their conversation shifted to lighter topics. Over the next few weeks, their budding friendship deepened. Alex would sometimes text her a new recipe to try, or they'd bump into each other during her morning walks and sit on a park bench, watching the world go by as they talked about everything and nothing. For Margo, these moments felt like a breath of fresh air in a life that had grown stagnant. Alex's presence brought a lightness she hadn't realized she'd been missing. He made her laugh, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in years. And though she didn't say it out loud, she began to look forward to those moments more than she cared to admit. One evening, Margo stood in her kitchen, chopping vegetables for a simple stew. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at the screen to see a message from Alex. "Tried that pasta recipe you mentioned. Total success. You're officially my new culinary inspiration." She smiled, shaking her head as she replied. "I think you're giving me too much credit. But I'm glad it turned out well." As she placed her phone down, Margo caught herself lingering on his message. It was such a small thing, yet it filled her chest with a warmth she couldn't ignore. Later that night, as she curled up in bed with a book, she realized her mind wasn't on the words in front of her. Instead, it drifted to Alex, his easy laugh, the way his eyes lit up when he talked about something he was passionate about, the gentle kindness in his every interaction. She closed the book and set it aside, leaning her head against the pillow. It wasn't just friendship anymore, was it? The realization hit her like a gust of wind, sudden and disorienting. She sat up, her heart racing. Alex was nearly 30 years younger than her. She had no business feeling this way. But no matter how much she tried to dismiss it, the truth was undeniable. Somewhere between their shared moments and his genuine kindness, her feelings had shifted. Margo wrapped her arms around herself, staring at the moonlight filtering through her window. What would Alex think if he knew? Would he laugh? Or worse, would he pity her? The next day, she was more guarded during their conversation at the park. Alex didn't seem to notice, chatting away about an upcoming food festival he wanted to attend. But Margo felt her walls rising, the fear of her own emotions threatening to undo the easy connection they had built. Later, she sat in her living room, replaying their interaction in her mind. Was she being foolish? Was it selfish to let herself feel this way? And yet, she couldn't deny the simple truth. For the first time in years, someone had stirred something inside her, a sense of life, of possibility, of hope. She sighed, closing her eyes as a single thought settled in her heart. She would have to face this. One way or another, Margo spent the following days in a storm of conflicting emotions. She couldn't look at herself in the mirror without questioning the absurdity of it all. "You're a grown woman, Margo. Get it together," she told herself, but the thought didn't stop her pulse from quickening every time her phone buzzed with a message from Alex. It wasn't just his youth that gave her pause. It was the unspoken rules of the world around her, the raised eyebrows, the whispers that would undoubtedly follow if anyone knew. Society wasn't kind to women like her, women who dared to feel, to want at her age. One evening, she stood by the window, watching the shadows lengthen across her garden. Her mind replayed every conversation she'd had with Alex, every shared laugh, every look that lingered just a little too long. The feelings weren't going away. That night, she called her best friend, Nora, who had been her confidant for decades. "Nora," Margo began hesitantly, "what would you think if a woman, someone our age, started to develop feelings for a younger man?" Nora laughed softly. "Depends. How much younger are we talking? Let's say 30 years. There was a long pause on the other end. "Oh, Margo, you're serious, aren't you?" "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Well," Nora said carefully, "do you think he feels the same?" "I don't know," Margo admitted, pacing the room. "It's not like he's done anything inappropriate. He's kind, thoughtful, but I don't think he sees me as anything more than a friend. And if he did..." The question stopped Margo in her tracks. If Alex felt the same, would she even dare to pursue it? The thought of opening her heart to him was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. "Margo, listen to me," Nora continued. "I know the world loves to judge women for daring to live on their own terms, especially women our age. But life's too short to let fear make all your decisions. If you're drawn to this man, maybe there's a reason for it." After the call, Margo sat in silence, turning Nora's words over in her mind. She began to reflect on her life. How much of it had been lived in careful compliance with expectations? Her marriage, her sacrifices for her family, the quiet resignation she had carried for years. And now, at 53, she found herself longing for something different, something entirely her own. Could she allow herself to explore these feelings, to risk the vulnerability that came with them? Or would she let the fear of judgment hold her back? The answer wasn't clear yet, but one thing was certain. Alex had awakened something within her, something that couldn't be easily ignored. The days that followed felt like a blur of hesitations and quiet decisions. Margo would catch herself drifting into thoughts of Alex, her mind oscillating between excitement and fear. She spent more time than she cared to admit thinking about him, how he made her feel seen, how he made her feel young in ways she hadn't imagined possible. But still, there was the weight of her doubts. What would it mean to invite him into her home? Would it shift the dynamic between them, making it harder to navigate? One afternoon, as she stood at the stove preparing lunch, she was struck by a sudden thought. Why not invite him over? It was an innocent enough gesture, a shared meal between friends. But something about the idea made her stomach flutter. She had never considered inviting him into her space, where the walls would close in around them and the reality of their connection would be palpable. It felt like crossing an invisible line. She glanced at her phone. Alex had just texted, "How about that cooking lesson next weekend? Maybe you could teach me one of your secret recipes." Her heart skipped a beat. She could hear his voice in her head, warm and playful. And there it was, an opening. She could take a step. She could offer an invitation. She took a deep breath and began typing. "How about dinner at my place tonight instead? I'll make something simple, and we can swap recipes." She hit send before her nerves could take over. Minutes later, her phone buzzed with his reply. "That sounds great. I'll bring dessert." The flutter in Margo's chest grew more intense, a mix of anticipation and apprehension. As the time for dinner drew closer, she found herself cleaning the house with an unfamiliar energy. It was a different kind of preparation, a nervous excitement laced with curiosity. When the doorbell rang, her heart jumped into her throat. She opened the door to find Alex standing there, a bag in hand and a smile on his face. He looked as effortlessly charming as always, dressed casually in a navy blue shirt and jeans, his hair tousled just enough to seem carefree. "Hey," he greeted her softly, his eyes lighting up with warmth as they met hers. "Hey," Margo responded, her voice trembling slightly. She stepped aside to let him in, feeling a slight rush of emotion. She was doing it. She was inviting him into her world, into her space. And it felt as if she was exposing herself in ways she hadn't allowed anyone to see in years. "Dinner smells incredible," Alex commented as he set the dessert down on the counter. "Thanks," she said, her fingers brushing his for a brief moment as they both reached for the same dish. The touch was fleeting, but it was enough to make her heart beat faster. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed more easily than it ever had before. The evening felt intimate, but not in a forced way, in a natural way, as if they were meant to be there, sharing this space and this time together. For the first time, Margo allowed herself to lean into the feeling, to let go of the reservations that had kept her distant. She looked at Alex, really looked at him, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of her emotions, the realization that this was no longer just a friendship. When they finished eating, they sat back, the quiet of the evening settling between them. Alex reached over and touched her hand, his fingers lingering for a moment longer than necessary. It was a simple gesture, but it was enough. "You're a great cook," he said, his voice soft. Margo smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her. "So are you?" But as the silence stretched, she realized there was more to their connection than just food, more than just companionship. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Margo's heart beat louder in her chest. She had crossed a line tonight, and as she looked at Alex, she wondered if he felt it too. The evening stretched on in a quiet harmony, punctuated only by their soft laughter and the occasional clink of their glasses. Alex had been open and relaxed from the moment he entered, as if this space, this dinner, had been waiting for him all along. And for Margo, It felt like the weight of years had lifted, if only for a few hours. After they finished the dessert a lemon tart Alex had made, they moved to the living room. The lights were dim, the soft hum of the street outside filtering in through the windows. They sat on opposite ends of the couch, but it didn't feel distant. Not anymore. The space between them was more like an invitation than a boundary. Alex leaned back, stretching his arms. "I've really enjoyed tonight," he said, his voice warm, like a familiar song. "Me too," Margo replied, her gaze not leaving his. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, his work, her favorite books, travel destinations, but the air felt different. There was something deeper now, a current running just beneath their words. Margo could feel it, and when their eyes met, she saw that he felt it too. Without thinking, she moved slightly closer, her leg brushing his. The contact was brief, but enough to send a ripple of warmth through her. She immediately pulled back, unsure, but then Alex's hand reached out, his fingers brushing her arm lightly in reassurance. It was the gentlest touch, but it was enough to speak volumes. "You're nervous," he said softly, his voice tender. "I'm just trying to process everything," Margo admitted, her voice shaky as she finally found the courage to speak her truth. "I didn't expect any of this." He nodded, a soft smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Neither did I." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't awkward, though. It was as if they were both waiting for something, both giving each other the space to be honest. The silence between them wasn't a gap, it was a bridge. Then, without thinking, Alex closed the distance between them, his hand now resting on hers. He looked at her with a seriousness that sent a shiver down her spine. "I don't know what this is, Margo, but I know I want to find out." His voice was quiet, as if the words themselves were fragile. Margo's heart raced. This wasn't just a casual connection, it was something deeper, more profound. She could feel it in the air around them. The longing, the uncertainty, the overwhelming desire to explore what lay beyond the surface. Her breath caught in her throat as she met his gaze. This moment, this small electric moment, was everything. It was both terrifying and exhilarating. "I've never felt anything like this before," she whispered, the truth escaping her before she could stop it. "It scares me." Alex's thumb gently brushed over her knuckles, his touch grounding her. "It scares me too," he said softly. "But sometimes that's a good thing, right?" And then, as if the world had quieted for just a moment, they leaned in. Margo's heart pounded as Alex's lips brushed against hers, tentative, gentle, as though testing the waters. The kiss was soft, exploratory, but it was a kiss that carried all the weight of what they had been dancing around. It was the kiss that sealed everything, an unspoken promise, a new beginning. When they pulled away, there was a quiet understanding between them. No words were needed. The shared moment had said everything. "Let's not rush," Margo whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Alex nodded, his forehead resting against hers. "No rush. Just, let's see where this goes." And for the first time in years, Margo felt that the path ahead was uncertain, but full of possibility. The following days passed in a gentle swirl of contemplation. The kiss was never far from Margo's thoughts, but she tried her best to remain grounded. She went about her usual routine, work, errands, quiet evenings, but everything seemed to have changed. There was a lightness to her steps, an inexplicable energy that had taken root within her since that evening. She had always lived with the certainty that love was something for the young, something that faded with age, like a flower losing its color. Her friends had often joked about the impossibility of finding real love after a certain point in life, as if it were something out of reach, tucked away for the new and the beautiful, the vibrant. But Alex had shifted that paradigm for her. He hadn't seen her as anything other than who she was, someone worth discovering, worth cherishing. The age difference didn't matter to him. He made her feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with appearances or expectations, and everything to do with connection. Margo sat on her favorite chair one quiet evening, holding a glass of wine, and reflected on the path she'd walked. The loneliness of her life had felt comfortable at times, predictable. She had grown used to it, finding solace in solitude. But now, with Alex, it was like a door had opened and the outside world flooded in, raw and full of feeling. She thought about the fears that had held her back, the judgment she had anticipated from others. Society had always had a way of putting love into neat little boxes, acceptable for the young, the perfect, the flawless. But love didn't abide by those rules, did it? It didn't care about wrinkles or gray hairs or the years that had passed between their birth dates. And as she looked at herself, really looked, she realized how much she had denied herself. How often she had discounted her own desires, thinking that the joy of romance was only for the youthful, the unscarred. But she was here now, feeling something real, something deep, something that was just as vibrant as it had ever been. The phone buzzed, and Margot's heart gave a little jump when she saw Alex's name on the screen. "Hey, I was thinking of you. How's your evening going?" She smiled softly and typed a reply. "It's quiet, but thinking of you as well. I keep wondering what comes next for us." She sat back, feeling a little vulnerable but also excited. There was a beauty in being open to the unknown, in letting herself feel again without judgment or expectation. In the stillness of her living room, Margo realized that love wasn't something to chase or avoid. It was something to embrace, no matter what age you were. Age didn't define her heart or her ability to connect. It was the capacity to love, to take risks, to reach out to another person that mattered. And in that moment, Margo felt freer than she ever had before, unburdened by the years she had lived. The sound of her phone buzzing again pulled her from her reverie. She opened the message, and Alex's words hit her like a soft breath on a cold day. "I'm looking forward to seeing you soon. There's a lot I want to share." Margo's heart raced at the thought of him and the possibilities that lay ahead. There was no way to predict what would happen next. But for the first time in a long while, she didn't need to. She was ready to let life unfold, to accept the unexpected and cherish it for what it was. She put the phone down, closed her eyes, and took a deep, steadying breath. She was open to love, no matter the age, no matter the risks.
And that was enough.
As the days turned into weeks, the connection between Margo and Alex only deepened. What had begun as a tentative spark blossomed into something solid, something undeniably real. They spent more time together, long walks in the park, quiet evenings cooking dinner, hours of conversation that stretched far beyond the mundane. Every interaction was filled with a joy that seemed to come from a place of deep understanding. For Margo, this relationship had taught her more than she could have imagined. She had always been wary of the judgments of others, how they would look at her, how they would dismiss her, or worse, pity her. But through Alex, she learned that love was not bound by societal expectations. There were no lines, no rules that had to be followed. There was only the connection they shared, the bond that had formed without consideration of age, background, or time. She had once believed that love belonged to the young, to those whose hearts hadn't yet been tempered by the weight of experience. She had thought that romance, with its passions and uncertainties, was something that faded with age. But she had learned the truth, that love was timeless. It didn't care how old you were or what stage of life you were in. Love was simply love, pure and unrelenting, always willing to find a place in your heart, no matter how long it took to arrive. In Alex, she had found someone who made her feel cherished, desired, and seen in ways she had not felt in years. He had never asked her to be anything other than herself. With him, she was not a woman defined by her age or her past. She was just Margo, a woman who had a future, who had desires, and who was capable of loving in ways she had never known. And as for Alex, he had shown her that youth was not a barrier, but an invitation. It was an opportunity to step outside of herself, to break free of the expectations she had placed on her own heart, and to experience something that felt boundless and free. His affection was not born from a need to prove something, but from a genuine admiration for her as a person. Now, as she sat on her balcony one evening, looking out at the city lights, Margo couldn't help but smile. There was a freedom in embracing love at any stage of life. She no longer felt restricted by the ideas she had carried with her for so long. In Alex, she had found more than a lover. She had found a companion, a partner, and a reminder that it was never too late to follow your heart. No matter the age, no matter the years between them, they had forged a bond that was stronger than anything she had expected or imagined. Love had come to her not in the way she had anticipated, but in the way she needed it most. And for that, she was grateful. Love, she realized, didn't have a timeline. It simply arrived when it was ready, and when you were ready to let it in. And as the evening air wrapped around her, she felt a sense of peace she had never known. There were no more doubts, no more fears. There was only the quiet certainty that love, in its many forms, was the greatest gift life could offer. With a soft sigh, Margo looked at her phone again, the message from Alex waiting there. She smiled as she typed her reply, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. I'm looking forward to seeing you soon, too. There's so much more to explore. And with that, Margo embraced the next chapter of her life, ready to live it fully, without hesitation, without fear. She had found her heart again, and this time, it was beating strong.